Struggle was not red. I experienced it, being deprived, being oppressed, even confused. It's enough now, we're taking the power back. We're stronger than before, we're prouder, too strong. The worst is over. From Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar, from Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the AZAPO online political education series. And today we are continuing with the conversation. We are dealing with continental politics. I am playing host to Dr Mxolisi Notshulwana, my homeboy. He was born and bred in Port Elizabeth, KwaZulu, and matriculated at Loiso High School, which incidentally happens to be my high school as well. He holds a bachelor's degree in political economy from the University of Pennsylvania. He also has a master's degree in international political economy from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, and also holds a doctoral degree on regional economic integration, a PhD degree that he obtained from the University of Witwatersrand. He has taught at universities of Fort Hare and Nelson Mandela, and he's also helped shape the thinking in the economy of the country as during the time when he was a senior manager in the Office of the Presidency. Currently, he works as a senior manager infrastructure program at the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and he is a well-published writer, and having published and written and researched extensively in the areas of regional integration, the South African political economy, regional infrastructure, and as well as African development. Welcome, Dr. Mxolisi Notshulwana, to the AZAPO online political education series. And it's always a pleasure to have you on this program. It's going to be an interesting afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Today we are looking at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and also looking at it in terms of what happens on the continent, as well as its implications on the South African economy. Some of you may be aware that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is coming into operation as of the 1st of January 2021, and something that comes far back. It's been a long way since the time of the Lagos Agreement of 1980, when the whole concept of African free trade was conceptualized, and then there was the Abuja Agreement of 1991. That treaty that looked at the modalities of making this agreement practicable. And here we are, 54 of our countries in Africa have signed up for it, and they want to ensure that it is implemented. And my understanding is that 29 of the countries have already signed ratification agreements with their parliaments and governments, and to ensure that this agreement is implementable. And the threshold of 21 countries has already been reached as far back as I think a year or two ago, and we are now going full swing to its implementation. And I think it is the right time for us to begin to interrogate this agreement, understand what it is, understand its implications, not just on Africa, but also on the continent, not just the continent of Africa, but also on the economy of our country. And who is better at explaining this than you, Dr. Notshulwana? So can you take us through your views, your perspectives, and your understanding of the genesis of this thing, and look at its implications on Africa, and look at its implications on our continent, and what do we do as people of Azania going forward with this agreement being put into effect as of the 1st of January 2021. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Simpiwe, and good afternoon. And thanks for inviting me to share some ideas on this important subject. Indeed, the key elements of those grand strategic plans by the heads of state and government in Africa, the Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja Treaty, and further strategic positions that have been taken recently, we're highlighting one thing about regional integration in the continent, that African leaders recognize from early on that it has to be something that we do gradually, incrementally, progressively, to attain all these stages that we envisaged and were highlighted in sort of a linear way in those documents. And then it was October 2008 now as a build-up to that, where we saw the establishment of a grand free trade area, precursor to this one that we're talking about today, between the Common Market for East and Southern Africa, East African Community, and Southern African Development Community. It was called a tripartite free trade area, which precedes this one now that was adopted in March 2018, which now is a grand FTA that looks at the entire continent in the way that heads of state have envisaged that regional integration should proceed, with regional economic communities as centers of that work. From within, countries and governments would organize their positions in relation to their strength, in relation to their economic capacity, with a degree of variable speed, of course, given the different levels of development among the countries. So there has been an increasing consensus that trade is a powerful engine for economic growth and development for our continent. And there has been recognition as well that regional trade cooperation has to deal with some of the impediments that Africa has been dealing with for many years in respect to intra-regional trade. There are numbers that are bandied around quite correctly that we trade more with the rest of the world than with ourselves because of a range of things that we're going to talk about. Some of them are restrictions that are caused by tariff barriers that we hold, the quota systems and other arrangements that we have at the border and behind the border in terms of how we connect countries with one another. And also the scope and limitations in terms of the economies of scale that continue to marginalize the continent in respect to world trade. So this grand African continental free trade area will succeed if it moves beyond just merging what is obtaining within SADC, what is obtaining within the REX, and try to combine those, but by fundamentally looking at the structure of these economies and what exists as impediments to trade. And also dealing with the assumptions that we make when we talk about trade. You know, the theories that go about dynamic trade gains that are derived from trade creation agreements or trade facilitation systems that are set up between countries assume that countries have the capacity to indeed trade, to indeed produce. Because the point I've been making to you as an introduction earlier on in the week was industry is supposed to be the driver of this trade. For how can you trade if you cannot produce? I mean, it's the earlier work of the Southern African Development Community with a C in the 80s had an emphasis on that, where it located and gave specializations to specific countries to carry certain things. South Africa was heading the financial systems, but Botswana was dealing with the ICT and other things. Specialization in respect to what they can do, what they can contribute to the rest of the region as countries. So the industrial base, the productive capacity, the manufacturing capacity is important as a driver of trade. Because you can't trade, and our region is characterized by a large number of small economies that cannot produce because of the narrow industrial base, as well as the productive capacity. And most countries are landlocked, which is another issue that's written about extensively in respect to the challenges that we face as a continent. Because in order for countries to compete, they need to have corridors that will have access or create access for them to get into markets, to get into places where they can relate and trade at the global levels. But we're also faced with high trading costs that are attributable to efficiencies at the border, in the market, the structure of our markets, that are also located at a level at which we don't have a way of looking at how to connect countries in respect to the infrastructure facilities that we have, both soft and hard. At the hard levels are the ports and roads and the railway systems that are still outdated in the continent in terms of facilitating trade facilitation and trade. And those constraints at the physical level and at a softer side in terms of the ICT systems that we have, which creates delays at the border of about 8 to 10 hours, trucks waiting in border posts like Bayard Bridge because of some problems with connecting with the papers and other that should have been done while trucks were leaving a port of Durban before they get to the border if the systems were interconnected. So inadequate infrastructure results in high trade costs. And the lack of these roads, which is the work that I do now with my current employment in terms of the development of infrastructure in the rest of the continent, so that roads and rail create a seamless transmission in that trade facility and produce the capacity for countries to trade. But we have to combine all of these things with also the regulatory frameworks that are there that also need to be improved so that we align regional integration strategies from a national country basis into the regional normative objectives that are envisaged in an African free trade area or agreement like the one we're talking about. So it's an intergovernmental approach. It's not a supranational approach like you would imagine is happening in Europe. African heads of state and government recognize that our approach has to look at the condition of our economies, structure of our governments, our state system, and also the issue of sovereignty in itself and how it would be negotiated towards that center, which is intergovernmental. And how at a level of convergence, at the highest level, do we create political economies of substance in terms of how we deliberate about these things, from a position of looking at the reality as fact, looking at the reality of what is happening. So to summarize, that the persistence of these barriers, particularly around non-tariff barriers, will we'll have a break in terms of how we implement this Continental Agreement, and we'll continue to undermine the gains that could be derived in these agreements in terms of trade liberalization schemes and other things. And despite preferential tariff, restrictive rules of origin and other things are also at the heart of these trade agreements that we're going to have to look at and deliberate so as to enhance cross-border trade in a way that will improve and project development towards a behavior that is not protectionist, but towards a behavior amongst countries that promotes regional integration as well as development for the rest of the continent. So all of these regimes have to encourage also the reforms in terms of the regulatory frameworks that we have, whether you're looking at PPPs or corridor development. We have to have regulatory frameworks between countries, or the creation of one-stop border posts, so that there's an alignment from one side of the border. Officials in one country can link up with systems in the other country to create these efficiencies so that trade can exist in a myriad of ways without restrictions bordering on the collapse of such trade. So all these regimes will be successful, will succeed in terms, including this one, if they are able to deal with those problems at the bottom. So, I mean, in summary, those are the things that I just wanted to highlight, that the emphasis should be looking at countries in terms of their capacity to produce, their capacity to manufacture in order to trade. Because trade can't pull production, and production has to be the driver of trade. Production must push trade. So we acceded as a region of Southern Africa into a free trade area in 2008 in Sandton, South Africa. 15 countries signed into it. If you look at the numbers that are emerging in terms of our regional, just look at SADC as a region. The numbers are skewed in favor of South Africa. And the key point there is it's because it's got an industrial base that is more advanced than other countries. It can manufacture, it can trade, it can do a whole lot of things that other countries cannot. At a global level, it's similar to what is emerging with China as a factory of the world. It has the capacity to do things that other countries cannot. And given its economic strength and weight around its infrastructure built and the institutions that it has to drive that infrastructure within the country as well as its influences in the rest of the world, increasingly, it has become now the first biggest economy in the world, surpassing the US, because it has the capacity to do that from within itself. And has created institutions that are aligned at a highest level with the strategic objectives of the leadership within the Communist Party in China. It's a good example, but it's a country example. Maybe we shouldn't be deluded in comparing a country to a continent. Africa is made of 54 states, so I'm not clearly trying to draw a direct line with China, because China is a single country. Here we're dealing with 54 countries that are different in economic size, in their capacities to produce, in their levels of development, in their political systems, in relation to development. Because what's important, as I conclude, Simpiwe, is institutions that drive these things. Institutions are very critical to drive these things. And also the approach to regional integration is also important to understand, that our approach is intergovernmental. Governments drive regional integration. Heads of state and government drive regional integration. Institutions like the Secretariat and the SADC Tribunal and other institutions derive their authority and power from the governments. Protocols are signed, they are ratified by national parliaments. So we don't have the supranational agency that you would find in Europe, for instance, as an example. We don't have such, because of the approach that we chose as Africa in terms of coordinating at a certain level in respect to trade, in respect to infrastructure development, in respect to a range of other things, until we get these things aligned at the highest level and converge towards that regional development approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Notshulwana, on your introductory comments, and I think they were well appreciated and subject to a lot of engagement, I suppose.
Yeah.
And you've made some quite telling remarks with regards to the interplay and interrelationship between trade and production. That production should drive trade and not trade pulling production, and it seems that in our continent, trade is actually pulling production. It seems that it is quite difficult to trade in Africa, largely because of the scale of production that is there in our countries, and secondly, the barriers that you were talking about, and thirdly, the tariffs that are there. And fourthly, I might add, the lack of commonalities in the, documentation that is required to enable trade. Because it is quite daunting and quite interesting that you will find, for instance, between, the different borders of the various countries in Africa, different sets of, documentation that needs to be signed, that needs to be approved to enable trade and not speaking to one another. And the tariff arrangements that exist between countries not aligned properly, and thus unable to push, trade fast enough between the countries. You did indicate, the landlocked nature of our continent to a point where much of the trade was happening via, the sea, rather than the transportation between countries. I did indicate earlier, the interest I have in transportation people, goods, and services between countries in Africa, and found it quite alarming how difficult it is to travel between African countries as opposed to traveling between South Africa, for instance, and the rest of the world. It is much easier to go to London than it is to go to Central African Republic, for instance. The flights are so regular between the UK and South Africa, and yet if you want to travel just to Nigeria, you have to time yourself well, because there aren't as many flights between South Africa and Nigeria as there are between South Africa and the UK, despite these two countries being, one of the two top countries in the continent in terms of GDP and trade. What do we do? That is the question. What do we do to enable, the continent to be able to trade and to enable this agreement to work? I understand that the agreement has been signed, but I don't necessarily think that it has been signed with an expectation that by the 1st of January, everything will be running smooth. What are those kind of things that, those people who are signatories to this agreement are looking at to enable this agreement to have a good life ahead of itself? I'm here beginning to think about, for instance, the role of the African Development Bank, the role of the development banks of South Africa and other institutions in Africa that are supposed to enable, these kind of agreements to have a life that would enable, economic activity in Africa. Because I think the biggest thing for me is enough economic activity to enable trade between African countries. And what is also interesting is that you are saying trade is driven by governments. It is driven through agreements between states. And yet the people who are trading are not necessarily states, it's the private sector.
Yeah.
It's the private sector that has services to sell, that has, goods to sell. And those are the people who are battling the most in transporting their, services between countries, transporting their goods between countries. So your comments on that?
Yeah, it's a political process, Simpiwe, because if you are able to appreciate the difficulties you have at a border, you will place all of those within departments of governments or state that are competing for that area. The truckers associations, private sector people who are trading at the border have to deal with that. And all of those issues are issues that should be raised, not even at the border, but somewhere else within the structures of the government, of the systems that we have. So regional integration as a process itself is complex. It has the economic as well as the political dimensions to it. But we cannot put a line or draw a wall between the two. That's why we call these processes political economic, because the politics are as important as the economic aspects of it. So I put an emphasis on the political because there's a great deal of work that needs to happen in relation to all these things that you are talking about. The scale at which we are moving slowly in harmonizing the regulatory frameworks around corridor developments, for instance, or infrastructure development, or one-stop border posts, which are agreements that are there, that have been signed by the heads of state and government, and they keep talking about them repeatedly when they meet, but they don't okay at a political level, where now a system of implementation between ministries, between different countries, pushes such agreements into their implementation. Language is another issue. Or those of us who are transacting in infrastructure in the continent, when we go to West Africa, we're confronted by a different range of environment, both in terms of what we're talking about, regulatory framework, but as well as language. We have to read documents in French, get them to be interpreted, aligned with the thinking that we have, and all of those. Transportation is very difficult in the continent because of some of the artificial barriers that we put aside that are also have a political element into it because of rent-seeking behavior and other things and vested interests that are there. One of the key issues, for instance, that we've been grappling with, and the African leadership has been asking, why are we utilizing rail so poorly in the continent? While if you look at the studies that are done by World Bank and ourselves and African Development Bank, it shows that rail will relieve a great deal of strain from our public roads that are in decline in terms of their capacity. And also the costs will come down because rail will effectively create and bring about new efficiencies in terms of taking goods from one port. The difference between rail and road is that road you move from one point to another point, whereas rail is a terminal to a terminal, and then you have to create other logistics. But the advantages of rail are there. We're unable to do that because of a lot of vested interest in what is happening, including private sector. The truckers associations have vested interest in having those trucks traveling on the road than putting the cargo into rail. So there are those political economy issues that we have to. But the point you're making, Simpiwe, about understanding that regional integration happens, it also creates difficulties for us. For instance, if you look at the program for infrastructure development in Africa, which is a structure of projects that was developed in 2012 by African heads of state and government, emphasizing corridor development, emphasis on specific infrastructure, and then they gave headship or championship of some of these projects to individual heads of state. Our president is leading what is called the North-South Corridor. But at the base of those projects are projects that are located within states. We call them regional projects. We call them, but they are projects inside Grand Inga. Grand Inga is a huge hydro opportunity that is located in the DRC. It's located in one country. It's a regional project with benefits that can light up the entire continent. Lesotho Water Highlands. We've benefited for many years from, it's a project that is located in Lesotho and other projects. These are national projects. Now you have to treat the terrain very carefully because they're dealing with national politics. And they're dealing with political leadership that is ego around some of these things. And then, but at the regional level, there would have been pronouncements in terms of what this project can do for the entire region. So those are the things that you have to balance now as you relate to all these things.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that you mentioned some of these projects because, you know, some of us were involved with the, you know, Grand Inga as far back as, you know, year 2000, 2001. And I do remember when I was up in the DRC, you know, meeting up with, you know, some guys from the World Bank and discussing the impediments towards implementation of that Grand Inga project. And, you know, headquartered in Botswana, we are still discussing. It's been 2 years since then, and there hasn't been much movement, largely because of political issues and nothing else. That project, if you were to look at it, you know, it has got the capacity, Grand Inga, to electrify the whole continent of Africa, plus, you know, half of Europe for the next 50 years. And you know, such a beneficial, you know, project to the continent of Africa not getting, you know, the political attention that it deserves. Look at the fact that, you know, the Abuja Treaty was signed in 1991, which is some 29 years ago. And we are still discussing how we're going to trade in Africa, what we need to do to fast track and enable trading in Africa. I'm likely to see this really giving the impetus to you know, economic generation and economic activity in Africa, really. Or is this just another, you know, paper exercise that is going to take another 30 years before we can see the benefits of, you know, this free trade agreement that's been signed by and ratified by the 29 countries to date?
It will take leadership. It will take leadership, Sumpia, online. There are examples of how it was done. I mean, maybe we're highlighting too much on the negative side. There are early on in our democracy, we developed through, in fact, a regulatory framework that was very useful, a PPP structure that worked with the development of the Maputo Development Corridor. President Mandela and President Chisano aligned that at the highest level, defined what they wanted to do in terms of that N4 gateway, brought us in, brought Sasol in, brought all the entities from the Mozambican side to be aligned and created a corridor institution that works till today. It's one of the flagship projects that have been done between two governments that is working today as a corridor development. One-stop border posts, good example of how to do things at the highest level. President Mugabe and the Zambian counterparts, they did the Chirundu one-stop border post is flagged as an important example of how to do the regulatory alignment, all those intergovernmental structures that you have to align at the border so that officials on the other side are aligned with officials on the one side. And then you have a seamless transmission and facilitation of goods and services at the border. It happened at Chirundu. It's an example that is raised. We can do it at Byte Bridge. We can do it elsewhere if you copy those examples.
Yeah, no, thanks. May I, at this stage, just acknowledge the presence of some of the students who are doing postgraduate research at the University of Johannesburg who have joined us. I see some of them, and I would give special dispensation to them to engage with us on some of these questions. I do understand, talking to their professors, that they are doing research on the African continent and related matters, looking at the economy, looking at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and if they are interested in engaging us and asking questions, we would give them an opportunity to share their views and perspectives, and I wouldn't mind hearing their voices in this regard. And welcome to all of you. It's a great platform to be in, and also welcome all those of you who are watching us and connecting with us from the various countries and platforms. You are more than welcome to engage us as we continue this conversation about trade in Africa. One of the guys is asking the question about security of investment with regards to the means of production in other countries, and in his observation, he's seen governance and investments in some African countries as something that has enjoyed much respect. And if such happens, how it be trade improving, and how we to see real economic production and activity happening in Africa. Your views?
Very good point, very good question. It's at the core of how you facilitate good business by building up on those regulatory frameworks that are more aligned with some of the strategies at the political level that heads of state and government wants us to achieve as we do business in the continent. It's very difficult, and you have to deal with each case as you move and invest or trade in the rest of the continent. I mean, if you take the MOU that we have, for instance, as a country with the DRC on INGA, it looks at some aspects of that, because in terms of that MOU, South Africa is promised to buy about 500,000 megawatts of power, which will be transmitted through a set of arrangements with transit countries that include Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, all the way to the northern parts of our country around Limpopo, where that power would be sort of transmitted. There has to be arrangements that are done with those countries. There has to be an arrangement key done with the DRC to make sure that the security of supply on that is guaranteed from one government to the other, from one political system to the other. You have the sustenance of those things, including the policies that would guide. It's a very important question. I've got practical examples in relation to what we've done as a bank in the continent, in the sub-region of Southern Africa, where governments would look. I mean, governments are governments. They would look at what they have in relation to their fiscus, and they will see a project working somewhere, generating money, but some of the money is not getting into the fiscus, it's going into servicing the debt on the project, because the project is like I said, the project belongs to the government. It's a border post. It's a national asset. The government will confiscate that border and take it away and put its officials there to take that money, get it into the fiscus. The flow to the African Development Bank in terms of the servicing of that loan stops. DVSA doesn't get its money. World Bank doesn't. Government will. Those are the issues that we deal with.
Yeah. You mentioned that it's government projects and government is interested because they collect the revenue, put that back fiscus, and and quite interestingly, as they put it to the fiscus, 70% of it goes back to the banks, to the loan institutions like the IMF and the Bank that benefit out of this. Are our governments doing it for the citizenry, or are they doing it for the foreign direct investors that invest in the continent? I mean, I'm looking at the impact and the influence of countries like China that be very active in Africa right now. The influence of the World Bank, the IMF in the activities of the continent. One interesting thing that you may know about, I was looking at, for instance, the aluminium smelter in Mozambique is operated by Mozal. That plant is owned by the Germans. The Mitsubishi are owning, I think, about 51%, and South Africa is owning 25%, and the Mozambican government is a minority owner, owning about less than 25% of a plant that operates in their own country, and the beneficiaries, the real beneficiaries, are outside of Mozambique. And that seems to be permeating across the continent. You see these investments coming in, and not so much beneficial to the African countries themselves, and not so much beneficial to improving the fiscus of the various countries, that and these countries to come and trade in Africa. You look at some of the Lusophone countries, the Francophone countries in particular, all of their economy, I mean, recently, it was only about, is it last year that the Francophone countries were enabled to run their own banks? Because all along, I mean, their money was, their reserve banks were controlled in France, and all their resources had to be deposited to the French, and it was the French who were deciding how that money was to invest and to benefit, those citizens of those countries. Real patriotism in African leadership to enable African economy to thrive, to enable prosperity of economic activity in Africa in such a way that we see a real development of African people.
There are a couple of ways of looking at it. Quite honestly, the answer is states make decisions on the basis of what they have and what they don't have. So if you don't have money to do the kind of things that technical companies from South Africa and elsewhere in the world would do with the resources that you have, and then whatever you do about those resources will, in the main, be directed by other people coming from outside. The oil and gas resources in Mozambique, the extent to which the country will derive benefit for the people will depend on whether the government is able to structure those deals with those companies that are clubbing in now, including the Americans and all of them, and the South Africans, so that to create in those agreements levers for whatever is repatriated there, a large chunk of it, like you say, stays in the country. But the extent to which you are able to bargain for that when you don't have anything yourself is limited.
It's very limited.
China comes in with big, deep pockets. China says, it takes us to basic economics. It's called bartering. It's called bartering in economics. It says, look, you've got resources, we've got money. You want that bridge, or you want to dig those resources, we'll do for you for free. Give us this for 20 years.
Exactly.
Give us the aluminum. Give us this resource you have for 20 years. That's what China is doing. China understands.
They're doing it in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, they're doing it in Mozambique, and we see.
Doing it all over,
They're all over the continent, and I don't know, are they about to recolonize our continent, in front of our eyes? it's quite interesting. One other aspect that I wanted to tease out with you is the impact and the influence of the these agencies that upgrade and downgrade economies of the continent. And if you look at these agencies in the US, their view and voices are largely benefit of the American economy. But when it comes to our continent, my view is that they're not giving ratings status that is aligned to the views of governments in Africa. They will aid you to junk status just to enable themselves and enable their host countries to continue to benefit. And I mean, look at us, our country right now. We have been downgraded to almost junk status, which makes it even more difficult to get additional money that we can be able to pay easily, making us dependent effectively of foreign direct investors. For how are we going to be in this state of affairs? And what are the real investment consequences for the African continent? Is it not about time that we set up our own ratings agencies that would rate how we are doing in the African economy to our own benefit, like those ratings agencies do for the Americans and for the British, for instance?
Yeah, we could do that, but we have to start somewhere first before to be able to do that. It's a systems issue. There's ideology at the center of it. The global system of that was developed by the US after World War II underwrites all these things that you're talking about. So if there is to be a change in that system, it must be altered at the foundation in terms of its ideology. What informs it, what drives it, and the institutions that drive it, the Bretton Woods institution. So China is emerging, it brings alternatives, there's BRICS, there's this, there's a China Development Bank. The extent to which it's able to influence that movement, the point you are talking about, it has to start at a systems level first. China must tell us what is its view about the global liberal economic order that we've been having for the past 40 decades, since World War II, when the US took over from Great Britain and sponsored and underwritten and developed all these institutions, IMF, World Bank, WTO, all of them, sponsored them to drive this neoliberal agenda that you are talking about. The way out of it is ideological and a systems approach.
Look, I fully agree. It is, the way out of it is ideological, but you reckon it starts with the systems issue, but doesn't it start with leadership?
Yes.
I think
leadership will drive. Absolutely.
It starts with patriotic leadership, which doesn't seem to exist in the African continent. I don't know what your view is with the leadership that is provided by the African Union. Has it got the capacity to drive change in a sustainable, in such a way that we can see, prosperity of economies of Africa? Because they seem to be, allowing themselves to be influenced by whoever speaks first. And, you would wish that you could hear their voices, even if they speak last, saying something that benefits the African continent. I mean, this free trade agreement is something that it hopes would have changed the trajectory of the African economy by 2063. And I'm looking at the epochs. You start talking about this in 1980, and then you take 11 years to come to some kind of a treaty that gives you some direction in terms of the objectives and in terms of all the things that need to happen, and then you take another 30 years before you can sign an agreement that binds all of you into some action. And as that agreement, you have not enabled that agreement to be implementable. You still have of these trade barriers, in terms of the tariff structure, in terms of, like the paperwork and the documentation between countries, and the amount of time and effort it takes just to get, a paper approved by the various departments in the various, countries at the border posts. So where are we headed? Where are we really headed? What do we need to do as Africans to enable Africa to be run by Africans? I think that is the real question.
It's at the level of a number of things. Leadership is one of them. Having firm institutions that will be aligned with the vision of that leadership, working and directing us towards the normative objectives that are aligned by all in respect to that leadership, and also aligning our vision in respect to our responses to the rest of the world. That's where we seem to be floundering as a continent. And the other players, including China, understand that. They get us into a forum called FOCAC, Forum for whatever with China, all 54 states. Deals are not even deals, pronouncements at the highest level in terms of investments. That's where we've seen at the highest level, multilateral, highest level. But the deals, the actual investments themselves flowing from those pronouncements with China happen at a bilateral level, not at the multilateral level. The deals themselves, the business, it's a China to country level. So that's where I think the strengths and the efficiencies and the linkages need to be strengthened. We had a discussion with Europe in what is called economic partnership agreements. The continent was divided in relation to that. Our region was divided into 3 blocks in relation to how we negotiated with Europe away from the Cotonou Agreement. So you don't find those normative values aligned at the highest level in respect to what we want and in respect to how we should relate to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world does whatever it wants with us because we're not positioned carefully, aligned amongst ourselves as well in relation to what we want to do. So we'll go with China and parade and all of those things, sign these deals. They'll make commitments for the next 5 years. We're going to invest so much billions in Africa. But the way that flow of that money happens, it's not at a multilateral level. It's bilateral state action between China and Zimbabwe. And it would link with that bartering aspect that we're talking about. It will link with that bartering. So the more we converge these ideas at the highest level and have institutions that work to pursue the normative objectives of regional integration and have leadership that stands behind those institutions and gives them power to run with these projects, the more aligned I think we would be in terms of the challenges we are raising. But they are going to take time though, because it's a complex thing that we have to deal with. States still have a right to do whatever they do in the continent without any institution higher than the state saying anything to them. That's why I was saying to you, our regional integration approach is intergovernmental. It's not supranational. There's no agency beyond the state government in the continent.
But I mean, you're saying there's no agency beyond the state. Is the African Union not supposed to be that agency that provides that leadership at an intergovernmental level or at an African level, so to speak, supported by all the other development agencies like the AfDB, DBSA, and so forth?
Give it the institutional capacity to do that. Change its constitutive act or whatever provides power to it. Make it less of a coordinating body that raises funds and monies and connects monies with donor agencies, and make it follow the agenda of regional integration.
Is the African
make it
Union
implement that? Pardon me?
No, I hear you.
So, for instance, let me give you an example about our region. We used to have what is called SADC Tribunal. It was located in Namibia, Windhoek. It was set up by the heads of state and government in terms of the Constitutive Act of SADC to mediate disputes between parties within states. An issue emerges in the late 90s in Zimbabwe. Some farm guy called Campbell gets his farm confiscated by the Zimbabwean government. He approaches that tribunal, having failed to take his matter to the courts in Zimbabwe. And then it gets to that tribunal. That tribunal rules. The courts in Zimbabwe said, no, there's no jurisdiction for the tribunal. It's a matter that's internal to the sovereign state. The Zimbabwean government had the right to confiscate the farms, but it went to a SADC institution that's supposed to be now that agency that you are saying why the AU Commission is not. The tribunal pronounced in favor of Campbell, but the decision of the tribunal had to be implemented by the Zimbabwean government.
Yeah.
So the Zimbabwean government said, hell no, we are a state that's sovereign. We're not going to be told by a coordinating body that has no supranational authority over us. And in 2012, the heads of state and government met in Mozambique. Yes. President Chikaya Kikwete was the head of SADC at the time. They shut it down. The heads of state shut the tribunal down. They said, we created a monster here. If it happens to Zimbabwe, it's going to happen to us tomorrow. And they shut it down. Today, the SADC Secretariat is still undergoing processes of redeveloping a new tribunal. That's a practical example of supranational authority that is not there in an intergovernmental arrangement of regional integration as a process.
I see that some of the countries, I think belonging to ECOWAS in the west of the continent have decided on the common currency. Is it the CFA that they are beginning to roll out to those countries in ECOWAS? Is the issue of common currency, throughout the continent, something that is being considered as some kind of a trade leveler between countries, so that we can look at, the continent as a continent and not as, the 54 countries that are trading in multiple currencies, trading. We know right now, because of the multiplicity of currencies that exist, we choose to trade in American dollars as opposed to trading, in an African currency, so to speak. Is there consideration being given to developing some current, what is common currency for the continent of Africa, just to enable continental trade to thrive a little bit more? And perhaps to this is the language of trade. We do know that in some countries, Kiswahili has been promoted as a language of communication, and I suppose an enabler in trade, in some of the countries in the east of Africa. What are your reflections on these issues?
Yeah, the earlier documents you mentioned, Lagos Plan of Action and the Abuja Treaty, they sort of gave us a linear approach to regional integration in terms of the stages through which we should go through towards continental integration. So cooperation would be the first stage, trade would be next, customs union would be another one. And all of those stages come with different degrees of complexity.
Of course.
In terms of how you are aligned as countries. So the one you're talking about is before the end. It's before that point of monetary integration is just at the door.
Yeah,
It's what you have in the EU now with the Maastricht Treaty of 2001, which created problems for other countries. Great Britain said, no, we're not moving out of the pound because they see value in maintaining that system.
of course.
Theirs. So the only part of the world that has that highest level of integration is the European Union with the euro. It's a complex stage, Simpiwe, because we still have to deal with trade as the target in terms of those stages for the region. We acceded into trade, as I mentioned earlier, as SADC in 2008.
Yeah.
Do you know what was the target for the customs union? It was 2010.
Yeah, yeah.
And we never went there. The leadership told us, no, we're not ready to go to a customs union.
Yeah.
Now you are raising a stage further than a customs union, which is a monetary integration. We're still grappling with customs systems of overlapping memberships in this customs union and the other. I mean, all these processes are replete with difficulties, so we need to.
I can imagine. I want to give an opportunity to Disa Nkuna, who is one of the postgrad students at the University of Johannesburg. And Disa, you allowed to talk.
All right. Afternoon, Chair. Afternoon, Mxolisi Notshulwana.
Afternoon, sir.
Yeah. You know, I was actually writing on the African Continental Free Trade Area for my honors paper. I'm doing my honors at the University of Johannesburg. And of course, what I was writing about at the time is what are the things that are going to determine the success or the failure of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And, you know, in the paper, I had outlined a number of issues that I thought will be potential game changers. But, you know, I don't know what you guys think, but one of the central things that I came across, this is my argument, is that, you know, you've got this continent of Africa where so many countries in this continent are facing challenges, internal democratic challenges. You know, you've got so many countries that have been, that have been challenged by coups that have taken over the country. You know, you've got this increasing polarization of politics and so on and so on. And the thing that I believe, my argument is that until we get these things right, until we reach a point in Africa where we've got solid democratic systems, you know, even in a country like South Africa, which, you know, I don't want to blow our horn, but, you know, in the past 20 years, we've sort of performed the best, or we've been, you know, in the top 5 in sort of democratic and institutional performances. Even a country like us, we're going through many, many challenges in our political systems. And when you look at all of these political challenges, it makes it very, very difficult to argue for a strong case for how this thing will get going very quickly. So I want to hear you guys' thoughts on that.
Mm. And no, thanks for that. And I'll pass it to Dr. Notshulwana to engage with the question. And linked to that, it really is a question of you know, agency. Do we really have agency as you know, the various countries in Africa? Do we have power that we can bargain with to enable some of these things that we're talking about? And he talks of a solid democracy, and I suppose solid democracy is probably linked to the power that you know, each country wields, and as an enabling agency to foster change.
Yeah. No, this is correct, Simpiwe Chair. The institutions are important. Systems of governance are very important. How democratic those institutions are aligned in terms of the first principles in the Constitution in relation to people's development, very important. And all of those things define at the core what any arrangement that we accede to will have to have as a base. And that agency will be created if we firm up those institutional arrangements in relation to what needs to be done. And then the structures now that would follow as institutions to drive that process would have sought their value, their strength from those institutions and from that agency that you are talking about, Simpiwe, which is critical to drive. And we have to come to an agreement in respect to that as well, in relation to what form it will take, given the complexities and the difference in terms of the systems that DISA is talking about, that 54 states are situated in the rest of the continent. So it's a critical question. It's a very important question, because you can't drive anything without that base. It's important, and we're not gonna derive these dynamic gains in trade if we're not gonna have all these things that he's mentioning, including leadership. And the other things that you also mentioned, around the regulatory framework, the policy framework that has to align, and the language and other things that are important.
Yeah, which are very critical. You know, I'm also interested, Mxolisi, on the relationship that we have with you know, other institutions like the BRICS, for instance. Because if you look at the BRICS in its entirety, that's half the world's population, you know, meeting together and deciding to trade amongst themselves. And you see some of these countries, you know, being interested in what is happening in Africa and wanting to contribute to the development of Africa. Why is it so difficult for us to be as united as some of those countries are in pushing a developmental agenda in the true sense of development in Africa? Perhaps put differently, what do we need to do that has not been done that would enable us to move forward as a society or as a continent? You know, with all the impediments that you mentioned, because I think we have this tendency as a people of looking at, you know, all the issues that would make things not to work. And I want us to look at things differently and look at what is it that needs to happen for things to work properly, for these agreements to work, for these agreements not to, you know, gather dust in the offices of the presidents and you know, prime ministers of the various countries. What do we need to do, you know, to have a thriving economy, to have a thriving, committed leadership on the African continent? Because we seem to be, you know, suffering from the effects of colonialism, and now neocolonialism has engulfed us so much that we are able to move forward. When are we going to be a true Pan-African, you know, continent that enables itself and drives its own development? And what are those key things that we need to be looking at? And perhaps some of the, you know, scholars who are looking at thinking about the development of Africa should be talking about now. What should be at the melting pot of thinking that would drive, you know, prosperity, drive development, and drive independence of Africa, in your view?
It's those things that we talked about, Simpiwe. I think the first one that's critical in all of them is to recognize that in history, there's no country that has been developed by another. You develop yourself by making sure that you align at the highest level all the normative objectives of what you want to achieve with everything else that you have.
Even when you don't have the capacity to develop yourself. I think
well, you derive that capacity from elsewhere where you have it. The continent is diverse. There are pockets of success in the continent where capacity can be drawn and be expanded to other places. But we need to find a way, that political agency you were talking about, to be able to link those avenues. But let's not get too grand about what we can achieve. Let's recognize what we are, our strengths and our weaknesses, and work from there. Because even these grand objectives and plans also tend to delude us in respect to what we can do. That is where I started off, Simpiwe, and I said, this trade agreement will succeed if it recognizes that we need to do something in order to trade. You don't just trade. You have to produce. You need industry. You need manufacturing capacity, capability, and all of those things. South Africa has it. There's a thriving textile industry in Lesotho. Why can't we build that? And stop whatever we're doing in South Africa and make Lesotho a specialization country on that.
Yeah.
Go to another country, do the same thing, sort of specialized attribution in respect to the economic capacity located in each and every economy, and derive benefit there that will link into these normative objectives now around corridor developments.
Yeah.
In the rest of the region, in the rest of the continent. I think that the leaders envisaged this to be gradual, incremental in terms of the RACs in relation to that, because they even talk about variable speed at which we're going to get into these stages that we're talking about, that as we exceed into a free trade area, Malawi had to stand back.
Yeah.
Angola had to stand back and said, we're not ready.
Yeah.
And it's allowable in that system because you move at your own pace, in your own speed, given the levels at which you are at in relation to certain targets as we integrate. But the key point is for us to understand, because the critical question you are raising, how do we relate better with other players in the rest of the world? We will relate better with China, we'll relate better with the West, with Bretton Woods institutions, if we know the position that we hold as Africa, as a collective, not as disparate pieces of 54 states.
That is my issue.
Dr. That's where we need to get to.
We relate.
How we get into that, we elevate that understanding of the political agents.
You know, we seem to relate better with people outside of, people who, I don't know, is it a question of superiority complex that involved the African continent? Because we seem to want to relate better with UK, with US, and relate terribly with ourselves. And we have to speak to each other. We can't relate.
Yes.
And we can't recognize each other's existence. We can't recognize each other's power, and in fact, the power of the unity that should exist in Africa.
Yes.
I mean, talk about, the artificial borders that exist between our countries, and, the brouhaha that you get about xenophobic issues that come between countries, yet we have seen an exodus of people from Europe, from America, from Asia. Whenever we talk xenophobia, we never speak about the fact that we have a number of people from Europe who have continued to rape and pillage the African continent of its own resources. We never look at it from that perspective. And from a view of trading in Africa, why can't we just do away with these borders? Or is the intent of this, FTA to the extent of doing away with the borders to a point where we're saying, well, we are trading with each other, free of tariffs, free of barriers, and free of, all of the stumbling blocks that are in the way of enabling continental development?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, the one about doing away with the physical borders as we know them. They are a problem, as you explained quite well, Sipiwe. But I think the heads of state and government recognized the importance of us doing regional integration incrementally, gradually, and in the end, it will get us to a stage where we have to renegotiate those borders, but not work the other way around. It was proposed, I think, in 2012 by President Gaddafi when he was pushing for continental integration at that level, with borders being discussed, and people like President Begi and other people objected to that notion and emphasized the earlier versions of that thinking in terms of continental integration by projecting on those strategic documents that you mentioned, that this thing has to be gradual. State sovereignty is still something that is valued so much by African governments and states, including the borders. And how it was created, the way it was created is historical, we understand it, but how we move away from it, I think the African heads of state and government had a point in saying we need to be gradual and incremental, because it's very difficult to think that you will wake up and just do away with the structures of borders as we find them in the continent. We have to work through a system of connecting our peoples and countries to markets, to corridors, to systems that create livelihoods for them in those spaces. By joining those dots, those linkages, linking and make sure that the landlocked countries are enabled to, through corridors that are created, to access markets, to access ports and other avenues of development. And then in that way, would it incrementally be able to draw or redraw some of these things that need to be done. It's a very difficult one, Simpio, because they cling into that. The African heads of states and government, they cling into their sovereignty. They like it. The example about the tribunal was an example of that.
Exactly.
They cling into that thing. And yet we're talking about regional economic integration.
We're talking regional economy, talking integration. But you see, what I want us to talk about a little bit as we move towards the end of this conversation is as the power that resides with the private sector and the extent to which that private sector is Africanized. Because you see, if you have a private sector that is African, you also expect a private sector that is patriotic.
Yeah.
You have a private sector that is dominated by, foreign inhabitants. What is that those people once, because they don't care of what Nkuna was talking about, democracy, leadership, as long as the environment is conducive for them to make money, they come, they make money, they leave. And once they find that your Inga or your Grand Inga is not working, they go to Brazil and they go and find that the electricity is cheaper in Brazil, and they would establish, their sectors there and begin to trade and make money and go elsewhere, to the rest of the world. What is the extent of African private sector leadership in enabling the free trade agreement to thrive and exist?
Yeah, it's there, but in different degrees in relation to the things that you were talking about. Because private sector itself in the continent is it's a difficult concept to coin, because in certain instances, what exists in certain societies, states, governments, countries is that public space that is driven by government, and there's less of private sector. Unless you go to bigger economies like South Africa, Botswana, and other places with financial markets that are more expanded. And then you see now a great degree of private sector participation also there in areas that are in the main driven by those ulterior motives that you were mentioning. Difficulty in finding the connection now with that private sector in the economic diplomacy space, for instance, of a South African government doing business in the continent. It's a problem you have as a country. It's a problem we've been negotiating as DFIs with our government at a highest level in respect to the work that we can do in the continent to benefit our country. With this trade agreement that's coming, we'll have to sharpen those engagements, in ways that improve that alignment that you're talking about, so that we're able to carry with us as we bring in value in investment in infrastructure, our EPC, our engineering, procurement, construction companies, some of them are in decline, are finding difficulties in working in the continent. We saw what happened to Group 5 and other Marian Roberts and other companies.
And they just,
but there's still a great, but there's still a great degree of them that have capacities. Stefanotti Stokes is doing a lot of work in Mozambique, but how much of that work is aligned with what the South African government wants to do there?
Yeah.
Those are the things that we need to do. And then you expand it to a regional level, where you will talk about a regional private sector, that is the way you are talking, at a continental level. But the extent to which you go to those deeper levels has to be derived from what exists within nation states.
Indeed.
We don't have that in our country. We've been grappling with it for the past 26 years. We don't have a paper, we don't have a structure that is as clear as the China Inc. The Chinese government, when it goes to Africa, to the rest of it, lines up China construction, China, they all take their script from the Communist Party of China, they follow that. Similarly, the US does the same thing, USAID, all of them. The guys now are digging on some of the things that we do as banks here in the continent. All of them are aligned, they follow the president. Those institutions, private or public, they follow the president because they are aligned to some strategic economic diplomacy document that is clear, that is aligned, that has those intersections that you are talking about. So we have not defined those intersections as a country to explain what is called in political science South Africa's national interest. What is South Africa's national interest in its business orientation to the rest of the continent?
And then you may extend that very question and ask, what is Africa's continental interest?
Exactly. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Can I give an opportunity to Sakile Ndlovu, who is one of the postgrad students at the University of Johannesburg? We did indicate that we'll give them an opportunity to air their views and opinions on this platform. Sakile?
No. Good, thank you very much. Good day, gentlemen. Just before you asked that question regarding the private sector, I was already noting down my question regarding the role of the private sector as an enabler or a disenabler. So as people who suffer from South African exceptionalism, and we can see that in this country, global capital is consolidating itself. What is the speaker's view on the insistence from Treasury, from the Reserve Bank on privatization or of key parastatals? Because I'm of the, I subscribe to Keynesian economics. I believe that the state should be at the center of development. But in this country, it seems that we are regressing. Looking at the medium-term budget statement as well as the budget speech in February this year, there's already fiscal consolidation, austerity measures, and we're talking about an economy that does not reflect the true demographics of this country, where we still have beneficiaries of apartheid owning about 80% of the world. Look at the JSE, principal capital of measurement, still owned by the very same white people who are beneficiary of colonialism. So to what extent must the private sector play its role in helping the economy develop, especially because South African companies, a lot of them, they externalize their work. I have it all on note that currently they are holding over trillions. So are they not supposed to be assisting the government, in inducing development, especially because we know National Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank is not at the behest of the South African government? Thank you.
Thanks, Sakile, and we might as well get the last one from Disa. Okay, Disa, go for
thanks,
it.
Chair. Chair, I was so happy when Dr Mxolisi was speaking about, leveraging on our strengths as a continent, especially in SADC. He was speaking about how Lesotho has a strong textile industry. And the reason why I was happy when you were speaking about that is because when you look at trade, right, trade is governed by economic theory, right? Countries don't just trade because they don't have anything else better to do. They trade because of something that we call comparative advantage, right? How is it that I can leverage on your strengths while also mitigating my weaknesses? And how can that be done vis-a-vis? And the reason why we need to really pay attention to this is because if you look at the manufacturing industry, right, from the time of apartheid, and also our textile industry, you'll find that actually those two industries, especially the textile industries, we really haven't taken advantage, in those two industries, especially when you consider the fact that most countries, when countries industrialize, from low-income countries to medium-income countries, they always go through, not all times, but in most occasions, they have to go through the manufacturing and textile industry route. And in this country, that really hasn't happened. Of course, we have a manufacturing industry that's gaining strength now, but we really haven't taken advantage of the textile industry. So I think what's important for us to do as a continent is that, we're faced with so many countries that have got natural resource abundance, right? And many of the countries in Africa are labor-intensive countries. So I think we need to get to a position where we find out what is it that each country is good at making? What is it that each country can specialize? And then as a base, then we go forward from there.
Thanks, Tisa. Dr. Notshulwana?
Thanks, Tisa. I think that was very useful as an intervention in respect to what we can do. It points to, I think, a much more plausible way of looking at how we can maximize the value of the African Continental Free Trade Area by aligning those specialties, those things that we may be good at, and work closer with other countries to expand whatever is obtaining in those areas of our competence to create those advantages that you talk about. I think Sakile's intervention question is critical, very important. It's very worrying, actually. 26 years into democracy, you have a private sector that is unwilling. I mean, the people from COSATU, they call it, it's on strike. It's long been on strike. It has no inclination whatsoever to progressively address the issues that you are talking about, whether it's in relation to the targets that get outlined every year in the equity provisions of the Labor Department, which people have complained about repeatedly, including Mzwandile Manyi when he was the head of that institution. Clearly, the private sector in this country just doesn't want to play game. So what do? You need a stronger public service government with stronger tools, very smart tools to deal with tax evasion that is so complicated in the private sector, creates these avenues that Sakile is talking about, people dodging, playing game into the game and paying tax in a way that would expand that base from which Tito Mboweni has to work and other people have to work in our government. But it needs a more complicated structure of government with civil service that are attuned with that type of thinking, with policies that are strong to push the private sector, to push it hard, to fight with it if you have to, take it to court and other things, or get it out of the work that is in the domain of the state. But the very same private sector is the one that benefits a great deal from some of the services of the government, including the lawyers that government procures, consultancies and other things. Great deal of resources still channeled by the same state that complains about this private sector to the very same private sector. So that is what you have. You have also a government that is not, I think, attuned in terms of its thinking around some of these things. Because the private sector one is just like other things, ideological in this country, in terms of the transformation of our country to reflect these things that Usakile is talking about. It's worrying when you look at the economy. It's even more worrying when you look at other aspects. The one that comes so close to me is education. The way we so mess up our system since we took over as democrats, it points to that fundamental dislocation at an ideological thinking level to not know what we want to do. We accepted the liberal versions of if we treat our kids the same, we would have arrived of equality of opportunity. What kind of nonsense is that? And then you leave the metastructive edge of privilege that are located, clearly located in institutions that were created and designed to pursue certain things ideologically for certain groups, for certain cultures, and then we have to wait on the edges and put our kids into vans and buses into those institutions and close down other institutions that are black or allow them to collapse. And then create that valuation of sameness over institutions that we know their history. How do you agree with that? How do you agree to that? How did we get into such an agreement?
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Because privilege denies access that is attained to the very same agency of privilege. Denies it. These institutions that we send our kids to, they don't have them because they're untransformed. And they will never drive the agenda that this state wants unless it changes them. So as we're entering, Simpiwa, to conclude, make the point too long, as we're entering democracy, then we should have asked ourselves questions. What structure of economy do we want in the same debate that we are around RGP and GI? Similarly, in other areas of our economy, we should have asked the same question. As far as education is concerned, we should have asked what is going to be a South African school. Yeah. Is KwaZakele High School, Loiso High School, Grey High School a South African school? What is a South African? What is a South African university? Yeah. And from there, we move by defining and create those institutions based on the kind of values that we would have developed and agreed on in terms of our normative objectives on what we want to create.
Thanks, Dr. Mxolisi Notshulwana, and quite interesting views and opinions. But you know, the fact is, which we need to accept, is that we are still suffering from the effects of colonialism, and we are living in a neo-colonial Africa. And another fact is that we are living in a neoliberal setup. And another fact is those questions that you are asking are questions that have been asked. And what we have dished up with are the outcomes of the questions that were asked. And unfortunately, the outcomes of and the responses to the questions that were asked were not necessarily favorable to the interests of Africa, to the interest of you and I who think differently. The problem that you and I have is that we think different. And this platform encourages, thinking differently, and which is why we are here, to educate for liberation. And the kind of views and ideas and discussions we have should enable us to, be open to educating others about the views that we hold, so that we can begin to have a collective view of the world that would enable the kind of change that we desire. Thank you very much for your views and your participation in this program. I do understand it's been a very difficult week with the bereavement that you had. And again, condolences to you and your family. I expect that you would find time to prepare and come to this platform, but you did. And I commend you for your patriotism and making the time to come to this platform, and thank you very much. Also, thanks to the students from the University of Johannesburg for making the time and agreeing to participate in this conversation with us. It's been great interacting with them, and we look forward to them engaging us some more on this platform. And thanks to all the participants that came and joined us this afternoon as we moved forward with this program. The coming week is the National Council of the Azanian People's Organization, and resultantly, we will not have this platform going. We want everybody who is a member of AZAPO to participate in the AZAPO policy formulation activities that would be underway at the National Council of the Azanian People's Organization. We shall be able to join each other a week after the next week, whereupon we would be looking at other issues. And thank you very much. And as always, we love you all, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Listen, the struggle was not red. I experienced it, being deprived, being oppressed, even confused. It's enough now, we're taking the power back. We're stronger than before, we're prouder, too strong. The worst is over. From Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar. From Cape